Hey, good morning. This is Jay Frost, finally appearing on the screen, coming to you live, of course, from Yokohama. And I'm so happy to welcome you at this kind of different time today. Glad you could join us live if you are joining us live. And if you're enjoying this as a recording, I know you will really enjoy the conversation we're about to have. Even though you can't participate in it live, we'll make sure that you have some contact information for our guest today so you can speak with him directly if you are missing out on the live conversation. But for those of you who are here and with us at this slightly different time, I hope you'll participate with the chat and the Q&A. That's the only way we can hear from you. So please do take advantage of that. And in fact, if you wouldn't mind warming that up, we'd really love that. So I know our guests would appreciate knowing where you're from, maybe which part of the country or the world, and also just maybe which organization you're with or the kind of work that you do. Anything you want to post there, we would love to have as a way to warm up the conversation today. And in fact, our guest is already doing that, so you can meet him there as well as on the screen. That's Eric Ressler, who I'm going to introduce to you in a moment. But first, not only do I want to welcome you, but I want to thank our sponsor, DonorSearch, who has been offering this series since 2016. I've been very happy to host in a series of conversations with a lot of really extraordinary folks, including our guest today. And if you want to learn more about the series or about your donors, you can do all that over at DonorSearch at donorsearch.net. Under the resources tab is where you'll find more information on the Philanthropy Mastermind series, including all our webcasts, webinars, and our podcast, which is for the ear. And I hope you'll enjoy all that over there or perhaps on the DonorSearch YouTube channel. So with that, of course, I want to welcome Eric Ressler. Eric is the founder and creative director at Cosmic. If you're not familiar with the firm, we're going to make sure that you have a link to it in the chat, and we'll make sure that's also included in the show notes. And you can learn a lot more about Cosmic there, but we'll learn about it live right now. Eric, thank you so much for taking some time to talk today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jay.
It's great to have you here. And you and I have had just one conversation prior, really, about brands. And so I'm really eager to hear your perspective on this because the issue, I think, for many of us in the nonprofit sector is to even understand what brand means in this world. And perhaps I'm overstating that. There are, I'm sure, people in this room who think about that a lot. But for many of us, especially in the fundraising world, I think we're just trying to bring in the money, and the brand, whatever that is, has already been established, or we hope that it has been. So when we go and talk to someone, we hope that they know what we're talking about. I'm not sure that's always true. So before we begin, I know I want to start with a little bit about you, but then if we can even talk about definitions, I think that might be helpful. So first of all, Eric, can you talk a little bit about your background and about Cosmic?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Eric Ressler. I'm the founder and creative director at Cosmic. We're a social impact creative agency. So we work primarily with nonprofits, but also B Corps, funders, organizations that exist to move humanity forward in one way or another. And, my background is in design. I've been a designer my entire professional life from a young age, very focused on creative expression through art, music, design, and ended up kind of falling into this profession. Didn't really intend to start an agency, but essentially just kind of fell into it, is the short version of it. After about 7 years running Cosmic as just an all-purpose creative agency, put a stake in the ground around serving the social impact sector, and we've been fiercely committed to exploring the power of brand and marketing for social impact ever since. So your first question is a common one. What even is brand as it relates to social impact organizations? A lot of times brand traditionally has been thought of as something that, corporations create who are, more profit driven, trying to reach consumers. And, that's true. But at the same time, brand, if you think about it as more than just being a logo, which is part of your brand, but certainly not all encompassing of your brand. The way that I think about it is that if you serve a population or an audience, you make a promise to that audience about what you stand for and the actions that you're going to take. And your brand is really the embodiment of that and how accurate you are in coming through on that promise as an organization. So every touch point, every experience, every communication, every message that you put out is either strengthening that brand promise or it's moving away from it. And so when you think about brand from that perspective, social impact organizations especially have a brand compared to even more corporate entities that are doing it to drive profit. And I think especially I want to pick up a little bit on how you talked about as a fundraiser, how you think about brand being something that hopefully it's done so you can do your work. I think that is actually part of the problem with brand not being fully integrated into the entire life cycle of, a social impact organization, especially one that is, raising funds through donors or through foundations. Because the power of brand really happens when brand and fundraising are integrated holistically instead of thought of as two separate silos.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because we've often talked about that in the series about marketing and fundraising,
Yeah.
or in the for-profit world, like marketing and sales. But this is a little bit different spin on it. Can you help make that distinction?
Yeah. The way that I think about it is that to build an effective brand is sort of a prerequisite to creating the conditions required to drive revenue generation. And so there are fundraising campaigns, there are marketing campaigns, and those are all powered by this more foundational long game approach to building a brand. So when you think about brand strategy, you think about a lot of the things that might show up in a strategic plan for an organization. Things like defining your niche, getting your messaging really clear, having a strategy and approach for your impact storytelling. All of these things I think about as conditions that help fundraising become more effective, because when you have those things established and clear, then your fundraising efforts are going to be bolstered by that clarity and those tools that you have so that you can reach the right partners and donors and come to them with a clear message that helps differentiate your organizations from others in the same impact space or even just other organizations they might be looking to support in general. And I think that when we think about brand building for social impact organizations, specifically as it relates to creating the right conditions for fundraising, there's a few key things that sound really simple, but we see a lot of people either just get completely wrong or consistently have room for improvement on. And I'll mention a couple of these key things right now. So the first is that you need to have a very clearly defined niche as an organization. And you may think that you do, and you might even have a very clearly defined niche, but do your donors or potential donors and supporters understand that niche? Can they understand how your organization is different, what your unique strengths as an organization are compared to other organizations in the same issue area, without having a long call where you walk them through a schematic theory of change diagram to get that point across, right? So this is where brand and communications really comes in to start to plant those seeds even before a conversation with a potential donor. So having a clearly defined niche is just absolutely critical because that is what is going to help set you apart from other options that they have in terms of who they might support. It also, like at the end of the day, you really want to show up as being like the go-to organization for this particular issue or issue area, and that's what niche definition allows you to do. Go ahead,
As you
Jay.
were talking
Yeah.
about that, it struck me, you talked about schematic theory of change, and I haven't been in a situation where someone went through that with the donor, because it's often, here's our program, here's
Right.
what we do.
Yeah.
uh, and this is more than just how we do it, right? This is wow, now I have a rap song going through my head. But there's more to it than that. This is, and it's a more than, it sounds like it's a lot more than mission.
Yeah, exactly. And we can talk about niche just for a little bit longer because it's so important. Niche, I think about your niche as being kind of built by a few different ingredients. There's a lot of different ingredients you can use to build a niche out. So it could be, it's really like, how do you position yourself and differentiate yourself within your issue area? So let's say you're working on climate justice as an organization. There are
Mhm.
thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of climate justice organizations today, and there's just more and more. So how do you differentiate from all those other organizations? What are your unique strengths as an organization? How is your model different? How is your focus area or the population that you're serving different? Like all these things help you define your niche within the social impact, the broader social impact ecosystem in which you do your work, right? So those are just some examples. Your revenue model might be part of defining your niche, your operating model, the audience that you serve, your region if you're more regionally focused versus a national or internationally focused organization. Yeah, again, your unique strengths and differentiators. So all these things I think about as ingredients that you can combine to create a distinct niche that you can really own, that you can be the only organization doing it in this way for this cause. And I think that's really important because a lot of times, people just think that if we have an organization doing good work, that should be enough, right, to get support from people who care about that mission. And that's true to some degree, especially for smaller donors who are giving more from their hearts than from their minds. But At the same time, even they're looking at like, well, why should I support your organization compared to any of these other XYZ organizations doing similar work? And you have to have a very clear answer to that. Niche should really help clarify your answer to that. So that's one really key ingredient that we see, or pillar of doing this brand building work for fundraising. I think the other that's really important is kind of the ongoing impact storytelling around how you're actually making an impact as an organization. And everyone talks about impact storytelling.
Mhm.
We've heard it to death, but it doesn't really mean that organizations are doing it well. Because often what happens is, you have the same 3 to 5 impact stories that you're kind of just like circulating through, or case studies or whatever it is. But if they're not framed in a way that's creative and compelling and, scroll stopping, then people might not even see those stories. So you assume that everything you put out, people see. But especially in our digital channels being so noisy these days, or even like one on one communications, a lot of this stuff gets missed. So like really nailing that impact storytelling, and you can see how this branches off so clearly from brand and messaging and some of the strategic work that we're talking about is another really important element of that. I'd be happy to go more into that or talk about some of the other elements as well.
Well, yeah, we can do a dive into any of those pieces. I'm curious for a second about maybe an analog in the for-profit realm that'll help to clarify this, because when we think about Coca-Cola, we know what it is, or McDonald's, and we don't necessarily want to emulate those things, but
Right.
they are very clear, or at least I think they're clear in their branding. First of all, I should check myself and make sure that you agree that those are, and you may have a better one.
Yeah.
And then how that compares, or how there might be an example. Perhaps it's one you've worked with, perhaps it's just somebody else in the space where that brand is that clear, whether it's an American Cancer or a CARE or something, and they may not be good examples, but someone who has said, this is who we are, so much so that, as you said earlier, it's not just about the logo, but in fact, when you see the logo, it brings back all this series of memories and maybe even sounds like Coke has done for so many years, where
Yeah.
you associate them with a product, or in our case, the mission, the vision, and the practice.
Yeah, so I mean, let's do Coca-Cola as an example because I think it's a good example for how there's a difference between branding something like Coca-Cola and a social impact organization. So, at the end of the day, first of all, Coca-Cola has an exceptional budget for advertising and brand building, right, compared to any social impact organization. So they can spend and invest a ton of money building these associations with the color of their brand. I'm not sure if you saw a recent campaign. It was a cause marketing campaign actually they did where they talking about, I think, their can being recyclable or something. And so the billboards were these distorted, crushed logos on their Coca-Cola red, to the point where you couldn't even read Coca-Cola. But because they have such brand equity, because they've invested millions, if not billions of dollars in that over the years, it's Coke, even if you can't read the logo. Like we can't do that as a nonprofit. Like you don't have the resources to build those associations so deeply that you could distort your logo. But if you do a good job with your overall brand building, you can do similar things. I would say the big distinction between branding something like Coca-Cola and branding a social impact organization is that at the end of the day, Coca-Cola is trying to sell you a product, right? They're trying to sell you, and they do that in a clever way by really selling you a story about your identity if you are a Coca-Cola drinker, right? Because it's more than just like drinking sugar water. Like that's not their message ever, right? It's really, even though at the end of the day, that's what they're selling you and that's what you're buying. So you could say, well, I'm buying an experience because I enjoy drinking Coca-Cola and it makes me feel good. But if you look at their advertising campaigns traditionally and over the years, it's always been about creating a sense of identity and belonging as a Coca-Cola drinker, right? And so in that way, it is maybe a little similar to how you might brand a social impact organization. The thing that I would say is different is that what we're trying to sell people, if you want to use that language, is a vision for a better future that aligns with their values and what they care about and their passions. And so it's not for them in the same way. At the same time, you do need to there is a return on investment that you need to provide donors, right? And that should be proof of impact, a sense of belonging, feeling like they're making a difference. Like these are the outcomes they're looking for. more so than, a rush of sugar or whatever other kind of corporate product we might be kind of referring to. So in that way, like a lot of the foundational principles of effective branding and marketing do translate from the corporate sector into the social impact sector. But there's that really important distinction around we are not selling something that is meant to create like material value for our supporters so much as it is to create a better version of a future that they align with from a value standpoint. It's an important distinction.
And so, can you give us an example of a social impact organization that has done that exceptionally well, whether it's small or large, but especially something that many of us are bound to recognize, and that represents that kind of successful
Yeah,
brand
I can
brand.
give you two, and I'll try and pick examples that everyone knows about because if I pick like a niche example, people might not know. So, if we want to talk about a nonprofit, the go-to example of a nonprofit who's done an exceptional job with brand building would be Charity Water. And that's not a mistake. They built an agency within their organization to invest in brand building, and not everyone's been able to do that. And so, because they've made that investment, they've done an exceptional job of having crystal clear messaging. We can talk about their model and how that relate their financial model of having all their overhead covered and the pros and cons of that and the messaging around that. I think that's a really interesting topic. But they've done an exceptional job of brand building and storytelling and investing in that in a very crystal clear way that really just rings true for so many people who they do a really good job making a case for the importance of their work. And I think that's something that I was going to get to anyway, so this is a good segue because I think oftentimes if you're in the thick of it each day, you intuitively understand how important your mission is, but you can't necessarily assume that other people do, right? And so there's a prerogative that you have to consistently remind people, to educate people, to inspire people around why your cause matters and why your mission is still important, why it's important today, why it's going to be important tomorrow and in 10 years, and why, people should sign up to support and get on board with that mission if they align with those values. And so Charity Water's done an exceptionally good job at that. And you can just see it in everything from their branding, their messaging, the way they run their campaigns. If you subscribe to their emails, very story driven, very, clear on impact. They do a really good job of connecting the dots around if you support them, how that support has led to tangible material impact. These are the kind of things that, really move the needle. A kind of B Corp auxiliary example would be Patagonia. Like Patagonia, at the end of the day, another kind of like common example to use, but for good reason. Patagonia has done an exceptional job building a brand around the values that kind of influence not just their marketing, it's more than cause marketing. They actually take actions that align with their values. So they walk the talk essentially, right? So they've done an exceptional job of building a brand that is more than just, outdoor wear or adventure. It's about sustainability from, start to finish and building things in a more responsible way, building products that last, having, repair programs so that if you buy something from Patagonia, you can get it repaired for free forever. So they really, and this is the difference between, essentially like cause marketing or even cause washing to like truly sustainable, cause and mission driven work, even if you're not a nonprofit organization.
Yeah, we didn't prep for this, so now this is the pop quiz, and I'm sorry if it comes off that way. But you've given these good, really excellent, clear examples of things that work. I guess without naming an organization, can you give us an example of something that doesn't? And the reason why I'm asking for that is because if we can see where the holes are, we might figure out how to build those bridges. Because as you
Yep.
said, Charity Water, they built that internal agency. And we
Yep.
could probably spend the next hour without even talking about the mission or anything else about how they managed to do that, how they came with the finances for it, the talent, how the staff implemented it. There are a lot of different things. How they kept checking it. What is
Yeah.
the evolution of that message over time, which we could do with Coke too, which would be interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but for most organizations, it's often that terrible analogy, which I hear people do all the time about building a plane while flying it.
Yeah.
And so the pieces don't necessarily all line up or align. Can you give us an example, maybe anonymized, of something that didn't work and maybe how it can be made better? Because if people can see that you can go from where you are to there,
Yeah.
maybe it's a little easier to imagine.
Yeah, I think maybe the most helpful approach here, instead of like trying to like anonymize an organization, is maybe talk about some of the like common issues, right?
Uh,
So, first of all, I want to just acknowledge that I know everyone's doing their best on this, right? And I think one of the bigger issues that we see is this kind of, and I think everyone's going to be familiar with this essentially this catch 22 of like you need resources to invest in things like brand building, and brand building can lead to generating new revenue and resources, right? So the thing, and I think that's maybe where I'll go with this, which is that you do not need to put your entire business on pause to do this work and stop and get it fully finished and then go back to doing work as usual. Like, and that's not reasonable. No one's done that. Charity Water didn't do that, right? Patagonia didn't do that. I do think it's important to build brand into the fabric of your organization. Ideally, some at least one person internally who can really own that. Brand, marketing, communications, and it should not be the development director who's already overworked as it is. Probably, it needs to be a separate position. The development director or whatever the title might be, or the development department and brand should be working closely together, certainly. But it's not something you just like toss into their job description. That's a recipe for disaster. So what I would say is like you do not need to worry about like putting everything on pause to do all of this work and then come back to it. So, I think really again, I'm going to continue to hammer on niche being really critical. Like you have to get that right. Even if you feel like you have that right, double check that, because what we often see is that you might start with a really clear niche as an organization, but as you grow and evolve, there might be mission creep or mission drift. Maybe that's because you had restricted grants that forced you to like spin up a new program and even new staff around that. And then all of a sudden your mission and your story starts to get a little bit like unclear and muddy, especially outside of the organization if they don't know the background of that and why that happened. So niche is 100% like where you need to start, like getting that really clear. Yeah, getting really clear on mission, vision, and values and how that's going to be implemented. Like all of these things are prerequisites to doing branding work effectively. What I will say is that often going through a branding process can help sharpen and crystallize your thinking on those things, right? So there's always this kind of push pull that happens there. And this should be something you reassess yearly, right? Like you don't do your niche work and then you're just done forever, because the world changes, your organization changes, the needs of your constituents and the folks that you serve, the communities that you serve change. So these are fluid things, right? Um, what I would say is if you don't consider this work as being integral to your work, if you think about it as like we're going to do our real work and then we're going to do all of our branding and marketing work to like tell people about it, that is the exact backwards way to think about it. And I would say that is like there's two like really big problems that we see. Like one, organizations just don't have budget to invest in this work because their funding is restricted or because they're just, constrained in resources in general, right? Which is a larger systemic issue in the nonprofit and social impact sector. Um, we could talk about that at some level, but that's one big problem. But even when organizations like are able to invest, if they don't fully integrate this work into their larger strategic plan and think about it as this kind of siloed thing, that often doesn't work either.
Yeah, as you were saying that, it struck me that first of all, you must have heard that a lot because you can talk about that so easily, but also that uh, people often don't invest in things. Like we often feel like we're resource poor, and that's true for the
Yeah.
sector. Sort of
Yeah.
like the way you said, everybody is working hard. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
But the things we work on, where we invest our time, and the money we invest, where we invest it, are emblematic to some degree of what we believe in. So
Yep.
if people think that, well, we need to do the real work, why are we doing this branding thing, which
Yeah.
sounds even more abstract, perhaps to many in the social impact space than marketing. Then I can imagine it's hard to make the internal argument first for creating or redesigning or imagining the brand,
Yeah.
and then for governing it, having a person who's specifically responsible in the organization for making sure that the Pantone color wheel has been properly, acknowledged and all of that. There's a lot to it, so people have to believe it in order to invest in it. How difficult is that? I mean, now speak from the cosmic lens. You have to go in and make that argument when you're pitching a project, I'm sure, but you must run into that hurdle all the time. It's less about do they have the money than do they have the will.
Well, so oddly, that's not an issue for us. And because usually by the time people get to us,
Uh,
they've tried on their own, they've tried with a nephew or whatever. They've maybe even tried with another agency and they're just stuck, right? Either they're stuck or they do understand the value of this work so much that they're willing to invest and bring an agency on to do the work. So usually by the time people to get to us, like we're not convincing people branding is important. They're coming to us because they know that, either because they've been following us or they've read our work or they've listened to our podcast or whatever. And they're like, okay, like I get this. I understand the value and the ROI of the investment. Like then it just comes down to like, how do we best use the resources that we've allocated to this? I do want to make another distinction though, because I think this is something that people often get caught up on, is like separating brand and marketing. And really, like those things also are really, not to be thought of as separate things, because um, one thing I think that's really started to happen is that marketing has become very transactional as of late, largely because so much of it happens digitally, and these digital platforms that we use give us all these, juicy analytics to dig into around conversions and engagement metrics and vanity metrics and all that kind of stuff. And it's important to look at those engagement signals. You shouldn't ignore them, but if you focus all of your efforts around optimizing for conversion or optimizing for transaction, you're missing the bigger picture of building deep relationships and ultimately community with your supporters. And that's where I think, if you think about this more from a brand building long game approach versus a short game transactional marketing approach of like raising a certain amount of money every month, whatever the metrics might be. Again, those metrics are important. Like you shouldn't completely ignore them, but you have to look at them more holistically around like, how are we showing up as an organization? What is the message that we're putting out there? Are we acting in good faith? Or are we using fake urgency to try and meet our fundraising deadline and goals for this year, and then burning bridges? And why is our donor retention all of a sudden so horrible? Oh, maybe it's because we've spammed them with so many asks and haven't provided any value in the meantime. So I think that's where taking a more brand building, long game, relational, community building approach instead of a short term transactional approach is the difference between brand building and just like transactional marketing.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't mean to talk about them that way. Just that I think people might have an idea of what marketing is, but it's actually what you were just describing. It's
Yes.
this series of things that we do in order to make it possible to have leads, so we can go out and sell, which is not language we commonly use in the nonprofit, the social impact space. But I think it is what we do, and so talking about brand in this more holistic way is I would think kind of liberating if we commit to it. So you just talked about how when people are already at that point where they get it, or where they believe, I should say,
Yeah.
that they can come and they can talk to you or to other agencies. But
Yep.
for those who have to make the argument internally, this is a common
Yeah.
theme, at least in my world, where if you want to do anything, then you have to show that, well, here is how this is gonna make money for us. And you just pointed out why we shouldn't focus exclusively on that, because there are lots of reasons not to do that.
Yeah.
But what in the initial internal conversation, to get people to think about what is possible, what are some of the ways that people could have that discussion internally so they can start
Yeah.
to imagine what that could be?
Yeah. So I'll talk to some of the like bigger benefits and return on investment of doing this kind of work. So, and I think it's really important to understand that oftentimes this is thought of as like only being beneficial from an external standpoint, but it's equally, if not more, beneficial from your internal cultural and organizational growth standpoint as well. I think at a high level, the goal of brand is to create clarity of purpose for your organization internally and externally. And so if you're at a point where that feels muddy or it feels disjointed, where there's not a consistent story internally or externally, where you're having trouble telling your impact story in a way that like resonates with potential donors or potential partners or potential, job candidates or whatever, this is a really good signal that, there's something that's not quite right about your brand. And so, some of the benefits would be creating that clarity both internally and externally is incredibly empowering and liberating, and can really make any effort that you are already doing significantly more impactful, significantly more effective, because you have that clarity of purpose. So that's like one very, broad, high level, almost like ripple effect benefit of doing this work, both internally and externally. I would say the other thing is that if you do branding work well, to use this same kind of terminology, you can create the conditions required for effective revenue generation. So branding work on its own is not going to generate revenue for you if you don't do some of the things you need to do to fundraise and build revenue anyway, right? But you're already doing that, or you should be if you're not, but almost everyone's already really focused on that. But they're often kind of in this scenario where they feel like they're chasing revenue. And I think the difference is that if you invest in branding and you do it well and you have the right kind of marketing and communications plans supporting that brand, you can move away from this kind of chasing revenue more to like a magnetic attraction of revenue where you have credibility and loyalty as an organization. You're building community, you have a reputation, you have awareness and affinity as a brand. And then you start to see opportunities, whether that's small, like many small donors or large donors or investors or institutional funders. There's just more credibility for your brand. You look like a credible organization. You have, if you do branding work well, you're doing a good job making a case for the importance of the mission, showing how your organization is actually making a material impact against that mission. These are the things that people want and need if they're going to invest in your organization. And I would say similarly, that's true for attracting the world's brightest minds. Like they want to work for organizations that are doing that work, are making a material impact, and are doing a good job of showing how that's happening. So again, this is not just about attracting revenue and external. This is also about generating the internal talent and retaining them to be able to, make a real difference against your mission.
Yeah, you've mentioned retention a couple of times, one about donors, the other is about staff. Those are the two, arguably the two greatest threats
Yeah.
for many of our organizations. And so that makes a lot of sense. And it's so funny when you think about it, because if Coke is ultimately selling sugar water, they don't have much of a problem getting people to be there. And I don't think it's all salary. I think it's because people know what they're selling, even if it is just sugar water. Sorry, Coke. It's very different for the organizations that you work with, or for groups like Charity Water or others that
Yeah.
are doing, or Patagonia, they're doing that kind of work. So I know that every organization is different, and this isn't an easy prescription, Dr. Eric, but if they were coming to you tomorrow and going through this exercise, is there a typical sequence for going through this? Because if we were doing just something that should follow brand, should not precede it, like a capital campaign, then in a capital campaign context, you would typically start with the case. I mean, hopefully you start with knowing what you want to do and roughly how much it costs everybody, but then you would write a case that describes in some detail why this is important. It hits that emotional center. It talks about how you can see yourself in the project, the vision we want to see. So do you kind of begin with the same kind of thing when it comes to the storytelling element of brand building?
Yeah. I mean, it really just depends. Like we understand like what are the kind of main pillars that are required long term to build an effective brand as a social impact organization. And so when we, are presented with a new client or potential case, we do an assessment on like where are their strengths and weaknesses there. So sometimes people have a really strong brand and reputation for that brand, but their digital ecosystem and infrastructure is really bad. So in that case, like, we know that's super important. So we're going to put more effort and energy towards that. Other times we're working with organizations that are spinning up a, completely new nonprofit or social enterprise or whatever. So they have an idea at that point, really, and nothing much else, right? Maybe they have some seed funding or whatever. So then we have to build the entire ecosystem from scratch, right? So it's hard to say, like, it really is case dependent based on where you're at in your trajectory and your growth as an organization and how much reputation and equity you have in your brand. Now, another thing that commonly happens though is that you do have a long-standing brand. Maybe it's 30 years old, maybe it's 50. Some of our clients have 150-year-old brands that are institutions, right? But the reputation and the cultural understanding of your brand is no longer reflective of where you are and, more importantly, where you want to go as an organization. And so then it's a time for a brand refresh or a repositioning, like looking at the niche again. How does that trickle out to all from, that kind of core trunk to all of the different branches around your digital experiences, your marketing, your fundraising, all the touch points where your brand actually shows up in the real world. So, what I can say is, like, we think about this at a high level. I'll try and be kind of concise here. Through this lens of this concept of the attention economy, which maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. If you haven't heard of it, you've definitely experienced it because we're all living in it. So Essentially today, information is free and flowing. Like there's no scarcity of information for most people in most of the world anymore. That didn't used to be true, but it's true now. And now, what is the prize to be won essentially is people's attention. And so our attention spans are short. We're overwhelmed with information. We're being pulled in lots of different directions. All of our digital channels are super noisy. So winning and capturing and sustaining attention is the biggest challenge you have to overcome as an organization. And so when we look at our work through that lens, we've identified essentially like kind of four key pillars that need to be strong to be able to break through in the attention economy. So the first one is largely what we've been talking about today, understanding how to execute a brand building versus transactional marketing approach to your work. So that's the first one. The second is learning how to create scroll stopping content, content that actually breaks through in all of these different channels where you're trying to reach people. Because if people don't see or interact with your content, then they don't understand how you're making an impact as an organization. So that scroll stopping content is the second kind of key pillar. The third is this digital experience side of things, like building best in class digital experiences. Because if you're doing all of this work to build a brand, doing a really good job creating scroll stopping content, but then your most important owned channel, your website, is a complete mess, then that is not going to reflect well on your organization, and you're not going to be able to use that asset as an operational asset for fundraising and for mobilizing and for building community. And then the fourth pillar is community building instead of thinking about things transactionally again. So nurturing a true community of supporters who care about your work, who you forge and nurture relationships with over time, who you engage, who you listen to, and who you think of as, not necessarily um, like peers, but supporters, right? So of people who they're not necessarily going to know more about your work than you are. Maybe some of them are experts and also support your work, but their passion is aligned, their values are aligned, and you need to not just think about them as donors who are going to open wallets and give you money, but you're mobilizing force that can create energy and momentum and community around your mission. And so, if you can do a good job, and you're not going to get perfect on any of these, none of these are ever done, but thinking about strengthening those four pillars, then everything else will become more effective from there.
Um, I wanted to ask you about evolution. That as you said, there are some organizations that you work with that are 30 years old, 50 years old, 150 years old, and over time, I'm sure that the way that that these things play out has to change, because if you are listening to the people who care about you, who identify with you, it's part of their identity to support the work, then how do you make sure that you are keeping in touch with the changing sentiments of emerging generations, especially over 150 years?
Yeah. Well, I think this is why that fourth pillar, community building, is so important. And that's the difference between nurturing community and just thinking about your donors as a spreadsheet, essentially, right? Because your donors are going to be not the only, but probably the most important channel of information for you around how culture is changing as it relates to your cause. And I think that's really the way to think about it, because so much is happening in the world right now. No matter what kind of cause area you're in, I'm sure there's transformation happening because of everything that's happening. And so you need to find a way to ensure that your mission and your cause remains relevant to broader culture. If you think about it as being this siloed thing that, oh, well, no one understands this work, but it's important, maybe there's some very niche scientific work like that, but that's the very rare exception, right? Like, and if we're talking about larger systemic societal justice issues, environmental issues, everything's global, everything's connected. And so having good approaches and um building a muscle around listening is just so crucial. So like being intentional and aware around what's happening and finding time. And I know it's hard, so I'm not trying to be naive here, to like take the blinders of the week in daily and weekly work off, and just kind of come up from air and just look around, like how are we relating to culture in general, and what are the things that we're seeing as kind of like larger societal trends, and how does that affect our mission? How can we tie our mission into those things to leverage some of that earned media that we can't afford to buy, but that these are the conversations people are already having. How can we tap into those conversations and relate our work to that? How can we listen to donor priorities and like what our supporters are saying and what they're asking for. And there's a balance here because you don't want to fall into the trap of being so donor centric that you lose sight of your own internal expertise because you're doing this work every day. But you also don't want to fall into the opposite side where you just kind of, charge ahead and just think of donors as like different, sources of income for your organization and just kind of other than that, you don't really care what they think, right? So I think that listening from your supporter group, from partner organizations, from your internal staff, and also just paying attention to what's happening in culture and how that relates to your mission.
Yeah, we have ears and eyes, use them all. I mean, actually coming, from both a design and a music background, that must really inform a lot of this stuff because even thinking about some of the things you mentioned before, I'm not sure about the Charity Water soundtrack, so to speak, but for Coke, it's been a huge piece of popular culture forever.
Yeah.
The adoption of music that already existed and then adapting it for Coke's use, and then that becoming part of the identity of the consumer.
Yep.
But I don't know how much of that is in our world, but sound is a huge part, whether it's listening to people like you just said, which has to be done all the time in every aspect of our work, but maybe also the sounds we make that we share say something about who we are. What's the most fun part about all this for you?
I mean, for me, I'm a curious person by nature. And so the most fun part of it for me is that I get to meet exceptionally intelligent, passionate people who do really important work, and I get to learn about all these issues that and approaches to solving these issues that I never would know about if I weren't doing this work. So that lights me up and keeps it interesting. It's also challenging, right? Because every time we bring a new client on, we have to understand deeply their niche, their issue area, the obstacles, the opportunities, right? And so we get to come in with the beginner's mind. Like our approach is never to try and become more expert at our work than our clients are. That's never going to happen. And that's not what we should be trying to do. But to come in with a broader viewpoint and an outside perspective and to quickly understand what's happening in the space and look for gaps between what we hear our clients say and what we see the world mirroring back to them around how their organization is perceived or potential opportunities for how to kind of change things up. So I think that keeps me very interested because I'm constantly learning. And for me, like learning is what keeps me creative. It's what keeps me energized and keeps me passionate about doing the work.
Yeah. Thank you for all this, Eric. Really appreciate it. And I know you're running off to another meeting, so we're going to have to let you roll. But if people want to learn more about you, follow your work, learn more about Cosmic and its work, how can they do that?
So there's two kind of main things I'll point you to. One is our website, designbycosmic.com, and really you can go there and find pretty much everything. We've got case studies and whatnot up there. But more importantly, I think if you're interested in trying to take some of these ideas and put them into action, we have an insights section of our site where we have a bunch of articles that we've published. We also released a podcast. We're on season 1. It's called Designing Tomorrow. You can find that on our site as well. The podcast especially would be really helpful because it's essentially a playbook and it covers a lot of these same topics, but in much more depth. So we have 10 episodes in season 1. The 10th one should come out in a week or so. And you can dive into that and hopefully learn a ton.
Excellent. Okay, we'll make sure we include a link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much for all of this. Congratulations on the podcast, and thank you for all you're doing to make sure that we're on brand, so to speak, in this sector. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Jay. I had fun today. Thank you.
It was fun talking with you. And so everybody, thanks for joining us live or here in the recording. Share this with your colleagues. I think we need to have this conversation more. And join me next week. We have one session next week on Tuesday before I fly back to the States. So that's going to be with Sharon Papo, who's going to be talking about connecting with purpose, 5 keys to authentic donor engagement. Hopefully following this conversation, this will help to inform that one. But I know you'll enjoy that. Sharon's got a new book that just came out also with the author of the Chicken and Soup for the Soul series. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, so join us for that on Tuesday. That's once again at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. Then we're going to be heading back into our 3:30 usual schedule. So until then, take care, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you soon.